I'm delighted to welcome Sir John Major, the former UK Prime Minister, to be our final keynote of the day, or rather fireside chat of the day. Sir John, thank you so much for being here, and welcome. I think it's fair to say that for much of your time as Prime Minister, you were battling to keep the Tory party together and the country together over the vexed issue of the EU. You also, in your 6.5 years...
Well, didn't it?
Yeah. You also, during your 6.5 years as Prime Minister, you worked very hard to help resolve the Irish question, the Northern Irish question, I should say, and laid the foundations for the peace process that followed soon after, the peace agreement that followed soon after. Clearly, now we've been out of the EU for nearly a fortnight with no real clarity on what relationships we're going to have with the EU going forward. And the question of the peace process in Northern Ireland has been raised as a potentially something that's at risk through the disruption that's been caused as a result. This is obviously not where you would hope for the UK to be. If you were in power now, what would you do?
Well, if I had been in power now, we wouldn't have left the European Union.
No.
I need not mince my words. I repeat what I've said repeatedly. I think that leaving the European Union was the worst foreign policy decision in my lifetime and the worst foreign policy decision by my country that I ever expect to see. So I think the circumstances would have been different, but that has happened. And we now have to move on from where we are. I think the negotiations will be extremely difficult. We'll come to that perhaps in a minute. But it does, of course, have an implication for Ireland in a number of ways. Firstly, because Ireland has a huge amount of trade with the United Kingdom. You are now inside the European Union. We are outside. And that is going to produce some particular difficulties, especially if we get no agreement on alignment of regulations. And it is the government's policy, that the British government's policy, that there will be no realignment because they wish to preserve their freedom to strike free trade deals with other countries with whom we trade far less than Europe. So there are obviously going to be some difficulties. My other concern about Ireland, and the principal concern I had about Ireland, would have been if they had retained the original ideas of having a hard land border between North and South. I thought and said publicly on many occasions that that would have been an extremely unwise way to proceed. And although I'm not a great fan of what has subsequently happened with the border down the Irish Sea, I do think it is a good deal less provocative, a good deal less inflammatory than a land border would have been. I always recall that the troubles in Northern Ireland actually began with the murder of customs officers at the very same customs border that was at one stage about to be reintroduced. Yes,
so hopefully less inflammatory than it might have been, but you mentioned the border down the Irish Sea. What does that do to the broader union?
Well, I think there are difficulties with it because the nature of the agreement that the Prime Minister reached after he ditched Mrs May's agreement has actually put Northern Ireland in a different relationship with the Customs Union and with the European Union than the rest of the United Kingdom. And quite how that will settle down is as yet unclear. We really don't have the negotiations on trade, which will clearly clarify many of the, at present, impenetrable outcomes of that particular development. But it's undoubtedly going to cause more difficulties for business. There is the particular problem, of course, of trade coming from the UK to Ireland onward to the European Union. And there are many questions like that that are going to pose very considerable difficulties for companies in Northern Ireland. So what happens over the next few months, what decisions are made, what extent people realise that those difficulties have to be dealt with, it's going to be extremely important.
Let me quickly ask you a question on finance, given we're at the European Financial Forum. It was floated the other day that the UK would like to have a status of permanent equivalence on regulatory matters pertaining to finance with the EU. that suggests that they don't want to diverge on rules, certainly not as much as they might want to on goods and perhaps other services. That seems to have been rejected out of hand as in the early stage of responses from the EU. What do you think about the merits of remaining aligned on financial services, as well as obviously on other areas?
I would have preferred us to remain aligned on financial services. I'm sure the government will seek equivalence and will ask for it, but I think the European Union are likely to say to them, well, if you wish alignment, if you wish equivalence, accept alignment. I think that is what they're likely to say. I mean, financial services, in the generality, are about 80% of the British economy. So it's extraordinary that the trade negotiations that we're going into are going to be concentrating on goods and not on services, because the knock-on effect of that, depending upon how the negotiations are conducted and what the relationship turns out to be and what agreements are made, you may find, for example, that British qualifications as a doctor, as a lawyer, are just not accepted across Europe. And I think many people are still underestimating the sheer difficulties there are going to be after 40 years of alignment and an ease of trade with all our European partners, when suddenly there are physical and operational impediments to that trade. It is going to be expensive. It's going to have all sorts of unforeseen effects that we haven't yet perhaps fully come to grips with. It's certainly going to be costly to business. It's likely to diminish the amount of trade, and it is an entirely self-inflicted wound that those who favour Brexit believe will be eased by free trade deals with countries outside the European Union. I am very dubious about that.
We'll come on to talk about Britain's place in the world, because I'd love to hear your thoughts on that. But just a quick aside for a moment, if I may. If you think about the reasons why people voted for Brexit, there were many who voted on the principle of sovereignty and so on. But there were many as well who voted as a kind of protest against feeling left behind, feeling that the EU, globalization, and everything that this kind of organization represented had brought them no benefits and brought lots of benefits to others. Sitting in Ireland here, it feels as if a similar motivation was behind, at least in part, the surprise boom in the Sinn Féin vote. I just wondered what your thoughts were on these two things and whether indeed there is a common element here.
You're very tempting. I must say, one of the first lessons I learned, and I'm hoping to pass this tip on to President Trump, is that it's extremely unwise to talk about other people's elections. You know less about them than the people concerned, and you're much wiser to keep your thoughts to yourself. As far as the UK is concerned, people were left behind. And this wasn't necessarily the work of the previous Conservative government or indeed their predecessors. It's more to do with the way in which the global economy works these days and the premium it places on new skills and the diminution of old traditional skills of one sort or another. And so people have been left behind. I think there's no doubt about that. And they were aggrieved, and I think you're right, many people did vote on matters like sovereignty, but others did vote for a whole range of reasons entirely unconnected with Europe. I had a whole range of letters after the 2016 referendum saying I voted to leave Europe because there was a delay in my receiving my social benefits, which had nothing whatever to do with Europe. It is the folly of referenda that it enables people not to change their government, but to express their dissatisfaction against that government on an issue unconnected with who runs the country. And there was a great deal of that. Whether that applied in Ireland, I am too modest to suggest an answer to that.
Very elegant. Do you think that, I don't know if it's a uniquely British thing, but for the whole time that we were part of the EU and its forerunner organisations, British politicians of all persuasions, I think, tended to point at Brussels and blame bad things that were happening in Britain on Brussels, which is one reason why you had the letters that you had. I think there was a lot of it became habitual to blame Brussels for everything. So I suppose my question is: are British politicians across the board to blame for this referendum result?
Well, in part, yes. In part, yes. Brussels can be absolutely infuriating. I mean, I strongly believe that Britain should be in Europe, because leaving is not only going to damage Britain, it is actually going to damage the European Union around the world as well, in a whole range of ways which people haven't focused on. We, in my judgment, will be weaker, but Europe will be weaker as well. And do we want a weaker Europe and a world increasingly effectively run by the Chinese and by the United States, with Europe trailing a long way behind? I don't wish to see that. I'd much rather Europe had a much bigger say in the way the world is going to develop. So I think it's wrong in many ways what has happened, and the damage to Europe may be intense. But it is absolutely infuriating from time to time. And it's partly because the European mind thinks differently from the Anglo-Saxon mind. And that often causes friction. It's often difficult to understand one another. I remember when I first met Jacques Delors, I'm sure you remember him, in about 1989. And I went to see him, and we sat down and had the sort of conversation that you normally have with someone with whom you know you're destined to disagree on many occasions. And we decided we would speak in his broken English, because his broken English was better than my almost non-existent French. So he began speaking about this European paragon called Douglas. And if everybody in Europe behaved like Douglas, he said, all would be well. Douglas understood Europe. He really was one of the finest statesmen Europe had ever seen. It's such a good job that Douglas was part of Europe. And I thought to myself, who is this wretched Dutchman? I'd never heard of him. And it turned out after a while, as I finally divined what he was talking about, he was talking about Douglas Hurd, the British Foreign Secretary. And it's an indication of how it is possible for us to misunderstand one another.
Yes, lost in translation. Britain's place in the world from here. There are those that argue that unshackled from the EU, the low growth, troubled in many ways EU, Britain will be able to seek closer ties, more profitable ties with the United States, with China, with other faster growing economies around the world. Is that a fair point, do you think?
Well, that's the ambition of the supporters of Brexit. And I'm all in favour of free trade agreements with the United States, with China, and with other people. Where I question is whether they will deliver as many benefits to us as did the other 27 nations of the European Union, who will in due course be rather more than 27 nations. Because there is a tendency these days for both America and China not to have multilateral trade deals, but to have bilateral trade deals. And the reason they are seeking bilateral trade deals is they are very big, and everybody else with whom they negotiate is a good deal smaller, which places them at a very large negotiating advantage. In short, America and China in bilateral deals are likely to get a deal that is good for America and China, but not necessarily so good for whomsoever they're negotiating with. Now, whether that will apply to the United Kingdom with its long-established ties with America is something no one can be certain about. But I am cautious about whether we will get these spectacular trade deals that people believe, because are Europe going to have a trade deal with China, with Japan? They've already got one. With India, with the United States? Yes, they are. And are 450 million Europeans going to get a better deal than 60 million Brits? Almost certainly they will. And if we were in Europe, we would have got the advantages of that deal. I mean, we're talking about doing a trade deal with Japan. If we'd stayed in the European Union, we would have got it, because the European Union have formed a trade deal with Japan. So we would have had these trade deals. They would just have been negotiated collectively for the whole of the European Union, and would have been almost certainly would have been more to the advantage of all Europe, including Britain, than 60 million Britons will be able to negotiate for themselves. So I am sceptical about the advantages of this. And then, of course, we would love to have a trade deal with India. But it isn't a credible proposition to go to India on Monday and say we'd like a trade deal, and on Tuesday and say, by the way, we're going to close down the number of visas and the amount of immigrants we're prepared to take. That doesn't strike me as being the best negotiating position I've ever heard. So I am sceptical about that. Of course we will get trade deals with many people. But don't forget, the day we left the European Union, we lost 53 free trade deals negotiated by Europe for the whole of the European Union that covers 70 countries. They are all gone. We can roll over some of the simple ones, but the bigger ones, like Japan, will not be rolled over, and it may take us a very considerable time to replace them. And without them, our trade will be at a disadvantage for quite a long time.
You've talked there about some of the challenges in negotiating global trade deals. What about the deal with Europe? We touched on the financial services element of that a moment ago, but what do you think the key obstacles are to a meaningful trade deal with the EU?
Well, I think there are two things that have happened that concern me. One is that the government has restricted the time for negotiation. There has to be a deal ratified by the end of the year. Well, by the time both Europe and the UK have got their negotiating remit ready, we're going to be into March. If you're going to have to ratify, the negotiation is going to have to be over by September. So deals which traditionally have taken many years and which are very, very complex are going to have to be agreed within a very short time. Well, now that means one of two things. Either we won't get a deal, or we will get a bare bones deal, a flimsy deal. I think we will get a deal, but I do think it will be a flimsy deal. And here is one of the difficulties. One of the successes in the British economy, some of you may remember the days of trade union disruption in the 60s and 70s of the British car industry, and that ended. And over the last 30 years, the British car industry has been enormously successful with its exports. But in any trade deal done with the European Union, we will have to provide 55% of the components of a car from Europe. Now, once we leave Europe, and Britain is no longer part of Europe, how is the British car industry going to provide 55% of components from Europe once British components are no longer counted as part of that? So that is going to put the car industry, one of our most successful industries, probably facing tariffs. The tariffs may not be too high, they may only be an average of 4%, so that is bearable. But it is the non-tariff barriers that so often go with that that might well cause real difficulties. And that is just one illustration of 20 or 30 I could give you about the complexity that is going to have to be reached. Now, how can you negotiate all those complexities in what is, in reality, a few months? It took 7 years for the European Union to do a trade deal with Canada, which is fairly flimsy, flimsy-ish anyway. The thought of us doing a comprehensive trade deal with Europe in that time, I think it would be a miracle if that were to occur. And I have been in politics too long to readily believe in miracles.
I suspect what Boris Johnson would say if he was here was that it worked last time to put a time limit on the withdrawal agreement because he did get it changed despite what the EU 27
He did get it changed by making concessions.
But partly by making concessions and partly by putting a deadline.
Well, is it a good deal? Is it a better deal than Mrs. May had?
Well, I'd like you to tell me what you think. You did concede that on one point around Northern Ireland it was better.
It was, because it got rid of the hard border.
Yes. But
that is certainly true.
Yes.
But it certainly wasn't better in treating Northern Ireland differently from the rest of the United Kingdom, which is a problem down the road that is going to have to be confronted. I don't think it was a great deal that was reached. It was quick, it was flimsy, and in many ways I think one could argue it was a less satisfactory deal for the long term than the one that Mrs. May had reached before. So of course you can reach a deal if you make concessions. Here you are, Europe, we'd like a deal, we'll accept everything you offer. But we're not doing that. We have set out a whole series of red lines. Mrs. May did that with her Lancaster House speech, you may recall, and the government are now doing it again in terms of saying what they will not accept. We need a time limit. We will not have compatible regulations. They're setting down, again, negatives that they will not accept, which doesn't suggest to me it is going to be a very easy negotiation. And it is very important for the long term, not just for next year or the year after, that the trade deal with the European Union is comprehensive and right. And I would like to see a comprehensive, worthwhile trade agreement with Europe. What I do not believe is that that is going to be credible within the limited time that has now been allowed for those negotiations. And there was no need for that time limit. It is a political decision that has been taken that has cut down the time for negotiation in one of the most complex trade deals that the world will ever have seen. And it's very easy to say, well, as some people did, it's very simple. We've got a template because we've been part of Europe. But that is simplistic, beyond imagination, when you actually come to negotiate the significant difficulties that lie ahead between the European position and the UK ambitions.
I want to take you back to happier times, because I think at a key...
Well, that shouldn't be too difficult.
At a key point in your premiership, you came to Dublin Castle for a very important meeting with Albert Reynolds, the then Taoiseach, which I believe led very quickly to what became known as the Downing Street Declaration, which in turn was the foundation for the peace process that then got signed, or the peace agreement that then got signed within a couple of years. Tell me of your memories of that meeting and how that process unfolded from there.
Well, I should tell you Albert was a very good friend. Albert and I had met when we were both finance ministers, and we had a very good relationship. And one of the first meetings I had as Prime Minister was with Albert, when I was shocked to discover that the British Prime Minister and the Taoiseach did not have regular meetings, even though we were the nearest neighbours. And we agreed that we would have regular meetings. And we were sharing a glass of Irish whiskey when we began to talk about the problems of Northern Ireland. And we both agreed that the violence was intolerable in Northern Ireland and on the mainland. And that if it had been happening in Surrey or Sussex, it would never have been allowed to continue. And we formed an agreement in that first meeting in the White Room at Downing Street that we would do everything we possibly could to find an agreed position between the British and Irish governments that would lead to the end of violence. And we got an awful long way. And of course, we were both pushing our own side of the agreement. I was furious with Albert because Albert was unable to pass a live microphone without stopping. And he was equally angry with me because he thought I'd leaked something that he had said, which, to the best of my knowledge, I don't think I had. In any event, we were both extremely irritated with one another. And we had reached a blockage in the Downing Street, what turned out to be the Downing Street Declaration. And I went to Dublin Castle, and it was a very frosty meeting. And eventually I picked up and was playing with my pencil and snapped it, which looked, and it was purely because it was a weak pencil, actually, it was no more than that. But anyway, it led to a huge, great row. We disappeared from the room. Albert let loose all his grievances about the British government. I let loose all my grievances about the way the Irish government had been behaving. And we emerged from the room even firmer friends than we had when we had gone into the room, and very swiftly reached an agreement on almost every issue that was outstanding, and within a few days on the phone finished the Downing Street agreement completely, just before Christmas '93, I think. And he was a man who... Albert was a dealer. Wherever Albert was, he thought there is a deal to be struck. And I always thought there was a deal to be struck, and so we found a middle way that provided a deal. But that little frenzy at Dublin Castle for a few minutes certainly pushed it along a little quicker than it might have gone.
That was a key element, obviously, and then along the way, all of the negotiations with the Northern Ireland
Yes.
parties and dissidents and so on were equally eventful, I'm sure.
Well, they were. Yes, indeed, they were. Because in something like this, when you have had a dispute that has gone on down through the ages for a very long time and has entered mythology and the political mainstream, there is a lot of fear about change. And there was a lot of fear and apprehension. And people were always absolutely on the lookout for the fact that they were going to be betrayed. And so it was very hard pounding to get towards an agreement. And every time we produced a draft, the Northern Irish would pore over it to see how green it was. And the Republic would pore over it to see how green it was as well. And it was a question of finding a balance. But eventually, with the help of a lot of people overlook how big a part the churches played in that too. There were a number of significant churchmen who were very helpful. And the other people who were immensely helpful was the peace movement in Northern Ireland, the women's peace movement in Northern Ireland, who began to express their views very forcibly. And slowly, what it did, the negotiations, the church, the peace movement, was push the men and women of violence into a position where their communities no longer supported the violence. And that was the key breakthrough. Once that happened, it began to be apparent to the people who were behind the violence that they had spent their whole lifetime doing it, and they didn't want the next generation to face the same struggle. And it was at that point that we could see we would get all the way through. And the biggest single regret of my political career was that we weren't able to see that through to what became the Belfast Agreement. I would like to have finished it. I'm delighted the way Tony Blair finished it. He picked it up where we were. He carried it forward. He did it in an exemplary way, and I'm delighted, and I've always paid tribute to him for doing that. But I've always regretted that I wasn't there to finish it.
Well, let us hope that significant process won't be undone by Brexit, and that the UK won't be undone by it, and the EU won't be damaged either. Those are all big hopes, but I'm sure we share them despite the challenges ahead. So, John Major, thank you so much.
Thank you.